For several thousands of years, Southern Africa and the people who lived in Southern Africa was a mystery to Europeans. They knew nothing about the region and they had not visited the region. It was a mystery. They didn't even know how big the continent was. Then suddenly, at the end of the 1400s, European explorers began to visit the region of Southern Africa. Then, by the 1600s, another group of Europeans began to establish the first settlement and eventually start to colonize parts of Southern Africa. Then eventually another group of Europeans came, and eventually in 1910, the country of South Africa was established, largely due to the influence of Europeans who drew up the borders. So the purpose of this video is to probe into the reasons why did Europeans start visiting Southern Africa at the end of the 1400s? Why did they start colonizing it in the 1600s? And it's intended that this video would provide context for some other videos on this channel, like the video on the Mineral Revolution and the video on the system of slavery that the Dutch East India Company introduced in the Cape Colony. So we're going to look at why did Europeans visit and colonize Southern Africa. Now, a commonly held misconception is that Europeans came to Southern Africa to take gold and to take advantage of its mineral resources. But Europeans began visiting Southern Africa in the 1400s. The first European settlement in South Africa was in 1652. But the gold discoveries was only in 1886, diamonds only in 1867. So why did Europeans come? So this video is going to focus on that. It's going to look briefly at the Portuguese and why the Portuguese, who were looking for an alternative route to reach the east for trading purposes, the rise of the Ottoman Empire in 1453 had implications on land routes to reach the Far East, where they would trade particularly in spices like black pepper, which was used for the preservation of meat. Then we're going to look at how the Dutch began to be involved in this trade. And unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch were interested in having a settlement in South Africa. We're going to look at why that was the case. And finally, we're going to look at why the British decided to come and take the colony that the Dutch had originally established, and how this would result in some group of the former inhabitants of that colony, the one that the Dutch established, to decide to go deeper inland into Southern Africa to establish other colonies. Now, if you look at a map of Africa, you'll notice that a very important feature is the Sahara Desert. And historically, the Sahara Desert acted as a kind of natural barrier separating sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa below the Sahara Desert, from North Africa. And when you look at ancient history, we tend to see that history around the Mediterranean world is largely interconnected. Rome, Egypt, Carthage, these North African and Southern European and Western Asian civilizations had clashed, traded with each other extensively. Now, there were trades that connected Africa below the Sahara Desert. Now, there was the Indian Ocean trade network, there was the Trans-Saharan trade network, there was the fact that Nubia was just south of Egypt and they played an important role in trade. So there was definitely trade that took place. But as far as understanding the people of Southern Africa or knowing about the size of the continent, for most people who lived in this Mediterranean world, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa was still a mystery to them. Now in the 1500s, this is going to change. And the reason it's going to change is largely due to a number of events. At the end of the 13th century, or the 1200s, the compass was invented, which gave navigators the ability to go sail much further. The Portuguese developed a ship called the Caravel, which was quite a sturdy ship, able to sail further down the Atlantic Ocean. But also particularly in 1453, you had the fall of Constantinople and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which were very hostile to Christian Europe. And depending on land trade networks to get to the Far East now became more challenging. And some groups of Europeans began to realize that if they can find an alternative route to get to the East, there's a lot of profit to be made. There's a lot of valuable resources in the East, particularly spices like nutmeg and black pepper, cinnamon. Black pepper, in fact, was at this time worth more than gold per its weight, because this is a time before refrigerators and understanding that ice helped preserve food. So black pepper played an important role in the preservation of meat. So any European power that could establish a sea route to get to the East would be able to make a lot of profit. And in the 1400s, so in 1452, or 1453, sorry, is when you had the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Now the Spanish and the Portuguese are going to be looking for an alternative route to get to the east for trading purposes. Now, we know that there were Christopher Columbus who thought that he could sail across the Atlantic Ocean and he could come around the world, come on the other side, get to the east. Now, there used to be a myth that people thought that he was crazy because they thought the world was flat and they thought that he would fall off the edge of the world. Today that myth is nobody believes it anymore, because at this stage Europeans had an understanding of the fact that the earth is round, one, and two, they had a decent understanding of the size of the earth. The circumference of the earth had already been calculated, and most people thought that Christopher Columbus was foolish because he's just going to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and this vast distance of the Atlantic Ocean, he will run out of resources and probably die a horrible death at sea. He believed that the earth is much smaller and it would be possible to sail around the world and come out on the other side. So 1492, very famous, Christopher Columbus's journey, and he accidentally discovers the Americas, the Caribbean islands. But the Portuguese had a different way of seeking a route to the east. And they began to realize that if you just keep sailing further and further down the west coast of Africa, eventually you'll be able to sail around Africa. So they would send explorers to go further down the west coast of Africa, come into contact with people who they had not previously come into contact with prior. During this time, the North Africans kind of served as a middleman. So some societies in West Africa, which produced gold, the North Africans would be able to take that gold, trade it with the Europeans, and they'd be able to make a bit of profit on the side. So the Portuguese believed that if you sail now and get direct access to these people, you'd be able to sort of cut out the middleman, generate profits, use that profits to finance further expeditions, sail further and further down the west coast of Africa until you pass the southernmost part of Africa. Once you do that, you'll be able to calculate how big Africa is, and you'll be able to then find a way to get to the Far East. So the long-term goal is to find a sea route to get to India, Indonesia, the land of the spices. Short-term goal is to trade with people who live in Africa and generate a lot of profits to be able to do that. Now, in 1482, Diego Cao, a Portuguese explorer, sails as far south as the mouth of the Congo River. And a few years later, in 1487, Bartholomew Diaz is sent. And Bartholomew Diaz, on his journey, he passes what is today Namibia, and he kind of gets blown off course. He notices the land is north as opposed to east, and realizes that he at this stage had passed the southernmost part of Africa. So he stops off at Mossel Bay, decides to experiment and trade with the indigenous people at Mossel Bay, who are the Khoikhoi. The trade does not succeed. It's kind of a disaster. Now, from the Khoikhoi perspective, these are people who live in southern Africa. They suddenly, for the first time, are seeing these large wooden vessels approach the land, these strange people who come off the ships. They've never seen people who dress like this, who look like this. And it's kind of an awkward encounter. Neither groups speak each other's language, so that initial contact is not very successful. Bartholomew Diaz, after reaching Mossel Bay, him and his crew, they go back to Portugal, and they tell King João, the king of Portugal, that he discovered a Cape of Storms. And the reason he says Cape of Storms is the weather at the Cape was very, very stormy, and it gave Bartholomew Diaz quite a lot of challenges. But King João, he tells him, don't be so pessimistic. This is not a Cape of Storms, it's a Cape of Good Hope, because the fact that you have reached the southernmost part of Africa means that it is now possible to sail around Africa, and we can finally have a sea route to get to the Far East. Technically speaking, it's not Cape Town or Cape Point, which is the southernmost part of Africa, it is Cape Agulhas. But the fact is that Bartholomew Diaz had shown that it is possible now for the Portuguese to sail past the southernmost part of Africa, and hence they could calculate the size of Africa, predict how long a journey to the Far East would take. Now, to understand some of this early Portuguese interaction with South Africans, it's important to understand who were the people who were living in South Africa at this time. Now, it's useful to categorize the people of South Africa at this time into three groups based on their mode of production. So, the three types of mode of productions that would be practiced at this time: hunter-gatherer, where you live in small groups, you go out, search for wild vegetation. That's what the women would do. The men would search after wild animals to hunt, and that was how they supported themselves. Pastoralism, which is similar to hunter-gatherer, except they also herded animals. So they kept domesticated animals. And finally, farming people who both keep domesticated animals but also cultivate their own crops. So in South Africa at this time, we have the original inhabitants, the people who have been living in South Africa since there's been settlements in South Africa. Since the first earliest people on earth who had populated South Africa were a group called the San. As roughly about 2,500 years ago, Bantu-speaking people who had been migrating, so Bantu-speaking farming people who are believed to have originated in modern-day Cameroon and Nigeria, they began to migrate to various other parts of Africa. And when they were in Botswana, they traded with a lot of the hunter-gatherer people there. And amongst the commodities that they traded were domesticated animals. And some of these San people adopted the practice of keeping animals, and it kind of altered their way of doing things a little bit. Now they become pastoralists, and hence we call those people the Khoikhoi. So the two groups of people who were found more in the western part of South Africa were the San and the Khoikhoi, and these were the people who first the Portuguese and later on the Dutch would originally have contact with. Now, the third group of people who had already populated this part of South Africa, but particularly more concentrated to the eastern parts of South Africa, where rainfall is higher, is a group that academics refer to as Bantu-speaking people. A major collection of languages or related languages that are spoken throughout sub-Saharan Africa is what are known as Bantu languages, and these people are farming people. So they occupied the eastern parts of South Africa, where rainfall is generally higher. So that's just a bit of background about the people who lived in South Africa at this time. So Bartolomeu Dias, he left Portugal in 1487. He reached South Africa 1488, went back to Portugal, and informed the Portuguese that it is possible to reach the southernmost part of Africa, and hence it's possible to sail around Africa, get an alternative route to the east, and establish a trade network. Now, I'm going to brush over a lot of complicated history, but the Pope eventually divides the world, gives half to Portugal and half to Spain. And the Portuguese, when Columbus discovered the New World, the Americas, there was a bit of excitement there, but Portugal afterwards decided to concentrate more on Africa, the Far East, and a Southern American area of Brazil. Now, 10 years, or about 10 years approximately, after Bartolomeu Dias, a larger fleet is sent. This one is on a route to go and establish a proper sea route to get to the east. It will be led by Vasco da Gama. Bartolomeu Dias would be a member of this crew. Bartolomeu Dias was more of a sailor, more of a navigator. Vasco da Gama, not so much. So he was equipped with a lot of good, experienced sailors and navigators, but far more militant kind of mission. Vasco da Gama would sail, and in 1497 he would reach South Africa. He would interact with the Khoikhoi, stop off at St. Helena Bay. They would have an interaction with the Khoikhoi, generally not too bad, but then for some undisclosed reason, a violence breaks out. Bartolomeu Dias is stabbed. They use cannon fire, shoot at the Khoikhoi, and you have another largely unsuccessful interaction. He would also sail to where Bartolomeu Dias had originally sailed, to Mossel Bay. There would be some trade, and trade is going to be important at this time because the Portuguese, and part of the reason they have to stop off somewhere in Africa, like South Africa, is because this is a ship journey to get to the east. It's many, many months. And if you stop off in a place like South Africa and there's people who have animals as a potential source of meat, you also need water. In fact, the reason that the Khoikhoi attacked Bartolomeu Dias was because they tried to access some of South Africa's water. And such a similar situation would happen here. So Khoi have meat that the Portuguese need. Portuguese have something that the Khoi value, and that is metal. The Khoi are not, unlike Bantu-speaking South Africans, they do not have the ability to mine metal, but they do have an understanding of metal. They're traded with Bantu-speaking people. They recognize the value of metal. Now Portuguese are arriving here with metal, very valuable. They give some animals or meat to the Portuguese. Portuguese will give them metal. So even though the language barriers exist, both groups recognize there's something of value that each side want, and hence you can have a kind of trade. But without permission of the elders, Vasco da Gama tries to collect water, and again violence breaks out. Vasco da Gama, after that journey, he sails all the way to the west coast of India, fills his ships full of supplies, comes back around South Africa, goes back to Portugal, and now the Portuguese have established a sea route to get to the east. Okay, so now the Portuguese are the first Europeans to make contact with South Africans, the first Europeans to reach South Africa. Why were they not the Europeans that colonized South Africa? They left a lot of evidence behind. I mean, the pedoras that Bartolomé Diaz and Vasco da Gama would have erected are, still displayed in some areas of South Africa. In fact, the province of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, comes from Vasco da Gama because he reached the coast on the 25th of December and named the region Torre de Natal, which basically means the birth of Christ in Portuguese. But why did they not colonize? And there's a number of reasons, or three in particular. First, the coastline at the Cape is very, very rocky, and the weather is very, very stormy. Rocky coastline, stormy weather, recipe for shipwreck. In fact, it's estimated that there have been since this period now that Vasco da Gama establishes a sea route, there would be about 3,000 ships that would sink around the southern coast of Africa. In fact, there's at least 1,000 known examples of ships that have wrecked along that coast. So the weather is not very good for stopping over as a halfway point. So remember, the journey from Portugal to get to the east in India, Indonesia, Malaysia is many, many months. You would want to stop off for fresh produce, for water, for meat, vegetation, etc. Can't stay on a ship all the time and run out of fresh food. But the potential of a shipwreck is very, very high if they stopped off at the Cape. Furthermore, their encounters with the Khoi were not very pleasant, so to speak. Bartolomé Diaz, when he attempted to trade with the Khoi, violence broke out. Vasco da Gama did manage to trade, but there was also instances of violence. Instead, the Portuguese, during their explorations of the west coast of Africa, and later, after Vasco da Gama established a sea route, even the east coast of Africa, they formed trading networks with the people of Angola and the people of Mozambique. So future Portuguese ships now that go to the east on this long sea route would rather stop off at Angola, where they found it easier to speak or to trade with the settled people of the West African coast along Angola, the East African coast along Mozambique, who are more used to trading, and Portuguese were able to establish trading networks, rather than come to the stormy weather of the Cape and try to trade with the Khoi. Now, another important aspect of Angola and Mozambique is that they sold slaves to Europeans. And after two important things are happening at the same time. Bartolomé Diaz and Vasco da Gama established a route around Africa to get to India. Columbus sails to the Americas and discovers the Caribbean islands and two new continents, North and South America. When the Europeans go there, they colonize. They don't really colonize Africa because it's not possible yet. During their dealings with Africa, they come as equals. They have muskets and types of primitive guns, but no means do they have the ability to colonize. So the idea of even trying to colonize is not something that they're thinking about at this point in time. Instead, come as equal trading partners. But in the Americas, conditions are quite different. And they start establishing large colonies with plantations, and they need to make those plantations profitable. They need slaves. They take some slaves from Europe. They try to enslave the Native Americans. Not ideal, but they, through trial and error, learned that the slaves that they buy from Africa end up being the best suited for working on the plantations in the Americas. And now the Portuguese recognize the value of slaves, so rather than stop off at South Africa and try and trade with the Khoikhoi, they could stop off at Angola, get access to the goods that the Angolans give them, including very valuable slaves, who they can then transport to their colony of Brazil in South America and make them work on the plantations. So they prefer not stopping off in South Africa. Now, the Khoikhoi, obviously, who are a nomadic people because they are pastoral, they don't live in large settled societies, they don't keep slaves, they're not going to trade slaves. Portuguese do try to capture slaves. You know, it's a common misconception that during the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans came to Africa and captured slaves. They weren't able to. If they tried, they usually ended up getting defeated. It was much easier to just trade with other Africans who would sell them slaves. So the Portuguese, there's a incident in 1510 where the Portuguese, well, an individual who served some time in the East as a viceroy, so Vasco da Gama established a route to the East. This individual, Francesco de Almeida, he went to the East. His term as viceroy came to an end. They sailed past the Cape. They thought, good idea to go and capture some Khoikhoi slaves, which they attempted to do, but the Khoikhoi fought back and it was a disaster, and Francesco de Almeida was killed. Portuguese, there's a couple of instances where they ended up having some violence with the Khoikhoi. Didn't end well for them. So even though the Khoikhoi are a nomadic people, their military ability to stand up to the Portuguese was quite good. So for various reasons, the Portuguese decided South Africa is not going to be a place where they're going to want to settle and want to colonize. Instead, that's going to be done by another group of Europeans. That will be the Dutch. Now, why were the Dutch the first to establish a European settlement in South Africa? To answer this question, I'm going to brush over a lot of important things very quickly. I'm going to simplify a more complicated story. If you are interested in this, there's a lot of readings in the video description of this video that you can look at, and there's even a podcast that's also mentioned that you can have a look at, which goes into more detail on this. But basically, during the late 1400s and the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain were the leading mercantile powers of Europe. They dominated the trade. Portugal went to the east, took advantage of very lucrative trade networks, brought back, made a lot of short-term wealth in Europe. Spain established some colonies in the Americas, got access to silver mines, also made a lot of money. Portugal colonized Brazil, and they were in a good position, but they didn't manage their finances very well. And over the next 100 years, from the 1500s to the 1600s, things are going to change, and two new mercantile powers are going to emerge, or going to dominate these trade networks. One is Britain, the other is the Netherlands. The Netherlands, or the Dutch, are going to be the ones who are going to establish a settlement at the Cape. Now, when the Portuguese were bringing spices from the east and other Asian goods to Europe, the Dutch actually were kind of the middlemen. They would trade this goods, get this goods from the Portuguese and distribute it throughout Europe. Now, as time goes on, due to various political reasons, things fragment between the Portuguese and the Dutch. The Dutch decide, they'll be in a better position to go directly to the east, get access to these resources, and they'll do a better job in this trade network. And in 1595, Cornelis and Frederick de Houtman are sent by merchants in the Netherlands to go to the east and try to establish some trade networks. And then by the beginning of the 1600s, two important companies are going to merge. In 1601, the English East India Company, and in 1602, the Dutch East India Company will be established. Today, historians speak about this as being like the first multinational corporation. the Dutch East India Company, 17 wealthy lords in the Netherlands, particularly Amsterdam, established this company. They would become known as the Heron 17. And this company is going to dominate trade now. It's going to be like a chartered company. And by the end of the 1600s, like 4,000 tons of pepper are being imported or traded by this Dutch East India Company. A lot of money is being made by this Dutch East India Company. And they start to dominate. From the early 1600s, they're going to dominate this trade. Now remember, the route from the Netherlands to the east is very, very long. So in those days, the sail ships that are being used cannot make this, they can't make this journey very quickly. It takes many, many months. And there's a high mortality among sailors. Lots of sailors are dying on this long journey. They get a disease known as scurvy. If you don't get in fresh fruit or fresh vegetables after a long period of time, eventually, you have a vitamin C deficiency and you get scurvy. So it's obviously very problematic if you're losing like about 1 in 6 sailors that die on these journeys because of how long you spend out at sea. So it's not an ideal situation. They do stop off at the Cape. They trade with the Khoi. Remember, the Portuguese would stop off at Angola and Mozambique. The Dutch and the English would stop off at the Cape. The English kind of make a couple of inroads, but it's still a difficult trade. You off to the Cape. By this stage, there's a number of Khoi who start to speak both English and speak Dutch. So there is, trade's a little bit easier, but it's not an ideal situation. Sometimes a ship may pass the Cape and interactions might be bad with the Khoi. They might attack the Khoi, steal animals as opposed to trade with animals. Then another passing ship will go, be unaware of this, and they go and expect to have a nice time trading with the Khoi, but the Khoi will seek revenge on that ship. So these sailors also very, very tired on this long journey. It's very difficult to try to trade with the Khoi and stuff like that. Wouldn't it be easier if you have a permanent European settlement at the Cape? And they live there, and they trade with the Khoi, establish relations, start growing fresh produce, get animals, and they will build a hospital. And the sick sailors on board the journey, if they're sick, they can get off, stay at the hospital, have an access to a vegetable garden, which will provide them with fresh vegetables and fruits and things like that. This might be a better situation. Now, what is going to initiate this? So remember, the Dutch East India Company is established in 1602. They're going to dominate the trade with the East now. Now, in 1647, a ship, remember there's a lot of shipwrecks at this time, a ship called the Haarlem of the Dutch East India Company crashes at the Cape and the crew are wrecked. There's a passing ship, but they decide not to rescue this crew because that passing ship is full of valuable trading goods. So the commander of that ship orders a junior merchant, Leonard Janssen, to look after this shipwreck crew. So he says, okay, I can't rescue you guys. We have to go back to Europe. But in about 8 months' time, there's going to be a bigger ship. It's going to leave the east. It'll pass. They can rescue you. But in the meantime, do the best you can. Leonard Janssen's in charge. Trade with the Khoi, build a makeshift fort, experiment with living at the Cape, and see what happens. So for the next 8 months, this crew of about 58 sailors are going to live at the Cape. And Janssen is going to work with a guy named Pruitt, and they're going to start compiling a report about the feasibility of having a permanent Dutch settlement at the Cape. Now, in 8 months' time, as promised, that larger ship will return from the east, and it will rescue this shipwreck crew, take them back to Europe. On board that larger ship is a senior merchant of the Dutch East India Company. His name is Jan van Riebeck. Now, Dutch East India Company merchants, the work they do, they make some money. They might feel that the money's not enough. They want to partake in private trade. But the Dutch East India Company have strict rules. You trade for the company. You do not take part in private trade or do any embezzlement or any other sneaky stuff on the side. Now, Van Riebeck, when he was in the East, he partook in private trade, illegal trade. And as a consequence, he's going to lose his job in the Dutch East India Company. So he gets discovered that he's partaking in illegal activities in the East. He goes, he's in Vietnam at this point in time, and he's enjoying the life as a merchant, but now he's in trouble for partaking in private trade, and possible punishment is he's going to lose his job. He happens to be on the ship that is going to rescue the shipwreck crew that wrecked in 1647 at the Cape. And he hears talk about this feasibility of establishing a refreshment or a European settlement that will serve as a refreshment station at the Cape. And he becomes interested in this. This might be his opportunity to get his job back. Now, Leonard Jansen, ironically, who had a very favorable view of the indigenous people at the Cape, the Khoikhoi, was not going to be the one who's going to lead this refreshment station. He was a junior merchant. Instead, Van Riebeck, who happened to have a very negative view of the indigenous people at the Cape, would be the one who selected to lead this refreshment station. Just quick note on Van Riebeck is that South Africans today will, especially during the apartheid period, a lot of South Africans will venerate Jan van Riebeck as the founder of South Africa and put a lot of emphasis on it. But yet, he never actually wanted that role for himself. He didn't particularly like South Africa. He didn't particularly want to be at the Cape. He loved the East. That's where he wanted to be. That's where he loved to be. But because he was in trouble for partaking in illegal trade, the punishment is he's probably going to lose his job. So he decides to volunteer to lead this commanders refreshment station at the Cape and make it a success. And if it's a success, he'll be rewarded by getting his job back as a merchant in the East. That's his goal. So the whole idea of founding South Africa or the country or European settlement in Southern Africa is not something that Van Riebeck ever set out for himself. Another irony with Van Riebeck, and this is something that Des Latham, who has a nice podcast on South Africa, which there's a link of that on the video description. He also mentions another irony with Van Riebeck is later on during the apartheid regime, when they were promoting racial exclusivity, passing laws to stop Europeans from reproducing with non-Europeans. Van Riebeck himself was actually a huge proponent of encouraging interracial relationships and having children. So that's just another contradiction. But anyway, Van Riebeck is going to be the person who's in charge of commanding this refreshment station at the Cape. And basically the idea is that for the next 10 years, the Dutch are going to have a refreshment station at the Cape. They have a high mortality amongst ships. Too many sailors are dying. This is a serious problem. If you have a permanent refreshment station at the Cape, so you have a settlement there, the people who are in charge of it will be under the orders of Van Riebeck, will build a fort so he can protect it from other European powers like the Portuguese or the French from attacking. Then they can have a vegetable garden which can grow fresh fruits and vegetables, so those sailors either en route to the East or from the East back to Europe can stop off and have some fresh vegetables, helps alleviate scurvy. There'll be a permanent source of water, permanent source of meat. They'll trade with the Khoikhoi. If they're sick, this refreshment station can also have a hospital. So it would help alleviate the serious problem of the high mortality, too many sailors dying. And Van Riebeck is basically in charge of this, and he has to make it work. He's going to be there for 10 years, and his job is make this a success so that he can earn his loyalty back with the Dutch East India Company, and he can get his job back in the East, which is what he ultimately wants. Okay, so this is meant to be a little refreshment station, not a large colony. In fact, the Dutch East India Company, the Hermann 17, the bosses of it, tell Van Riebeck to keep it small. The reason they don't want it to be a large colony is expensive. But then the question arises, if that was Van Riebeck's instructions, why did this become a large colony? And I'll get to that now, but the short answer to that question is because it wasn't succeeding in what it was supposed to do. And Van Riebeck came up with two solutions to help it succeed in what it was supposed to do. And those two solutions is what led to it growing. But I'll get to that now. So Van Riebeck is sent to the Cape in 1652, April 1652. He arrives at the Cape with 82 male employees of the Dutch East India Company and 7 women. And they are going to now have a lot of work. They're going to have to build a fort, get a vegetable garden, make good relations with the Khoikhoi to get some animals from them, and this must be a small refreshment station. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And, there's a stereotype that these workers of the Dutch East India Company were lazy, and Van Riebeck felt that they were lazy and they were not working hard enough. But their wages were quite meager. They were not high wages. They were relatively lowly paid, and there was a lot of work to be done. And Van Riebeck felt that there's too much work, there's too few people. But what's the solution? Do you bring in more people? And if you bring in more people, it's going to be more expensive. The Dutch East India Company are not going to want to pay more employees because these Europeans are there. Dutch East India Company feel, well, this is a refreshment station. It's not a colony. At this point in time, they don't have resources. They don't know what resources are in South Africa. It's not like this is generating wealth. It's just a refreshment station for merchants who are going to the east and returning. So they don't want to invest too much money by sending more workers or servants of the Dutch East India Company. And Van Riebeck wants slaves. But he's given very strict orders. Under no circumstances is he allowed to attack the indigenous people and try to enslave them, the Khoikhoi. Now, the reasons that the Dutch East India Company give him these strict orders is because it is expensive to fight wars. They want to keep costs low. If you want to go and establish a big colony at the Cape and you start fighting with the Khoikhoi and they start fighting back, then you got to send in soldiers. It's very expensive. So, and then he must have good relations with the Khoikhoi. Now, Van Riebeck says, why can't we have slaves? Slaves are valuable. Where are they getting slaves? They're buying slaves from the west coast of Africa, and the Dutch West India Company, not the Dutch East India Company, are taking those to the Americas where they generate profits. So they're not going to want to waste valuable slaves by giving it to the Cape. So Van Riebeck is frustrated with all these issues. And he's nonetheless at the Cape. He has to make the best of it. And there's disaster after disaster. They build a fort out of mud, it washes away, everything's going wrong. They get animals from the Khoikhoi, but they don't look after the animals die, etc., etc. Once again, I'm brushing over a lot of stuff. If you want more detail, check out some of the sources in the video description. But eventually, Van Riebeck comes up with these solutions. While he's constantly requesting slaves from the Heron 17, and they're constantly telling him no. In fact, within a few weeks of arriving at the Cape, he basically requests for slaves, and he gets told no. Now, he also feels that these workers of the Dutch East India Company are not doing a good job. And he feels part of the reason that they're not doing a good job is because there's no incentive for them to do a good job. They, in his opinion, are doing a bad job, but they're still getting paid a salary. Whether they work very hard or they don't work very hard, they get paid. So it means nothing to them. You're going to get paid the same anyway. Van Riebeck thinks, what if you release some of these workers of the Dutch East India Company? Let them establish farms around this refreshment station, which will be their farm. They will trade with the Khoikhoi, they will grow crops, they will supply the refreshment station with what it needs, and it will supply the passing ships. But if it's their farm, suddenly they're going to work harder, they're going to be more incentivized to. Because if you're a worker of the Dutch East India Company, you get paid a salary whether you do a good job, whether you do a bad job, whatever. But if it's your farm, all of a sudden you're going to want to work harder. So in 1657, 9 officials or workers of the Dutch East India Company are released from their contracts and now allowed to settle around the refreshment station on the land as free farmers. Now, on the land, who owns the land? You would say the Khoikhoi. Khoikhoi nomadic people, the San are nomadic people, they move around. So in one season they'll be in one area, another season they'll be in another area. 2 clashing modes of production. Dutch just have a different way of doing things. So they see vacant land, they establish a farm. It'll go to these burghers now. So this is something that Van Riebeck introduces in 1657. 1658. Now there are, I don't want to get into too much detail, there are a couple of private slaves at the Cape at this point in time, but it's not a system of slavery. A slave who happened to be escaping in the East, where the Dutch East India Company is doing trade, they are a lot of slaves. That's also a society that keeps slaves. And Dutch who work in the East end up owning slaves. But sometimes when a ship passes by the Cape, a slave might try to escape, get on the ship, end up at the Cape. Van Riebeck will take the slave as his own or give it to one of the officials there. But in 1658, the Dutch are going to intercept a ship of one of their enemies. Portuguese ship full of slaves is headed to their colony of Brazil. The Dutch intercept it, capture, bring these slaves to the Cape, and now slaves will be introduced and they'll be distributed amongst both the employees, well, some for the refreshment station, but some for those free burghers. Then another shipment of slaves will arrive this following year. Now the Dutch East India Company will give up its policy of forbidding Van Riebeeck from having slaves, but the slaves are not going to come from West Africa. They're not going to buy African slaves and bring them to the Cape because the Dutch West India Company has a monopoly. Instead, these slaves are going to come from a variety of places. Madagascar, East Africa, but particularly the East. Indonesia, India, Malaysia, where the Dutch East India Company is doing trade. That's where these slaves would come from. Now, a lot of slaves actually arrive like this. Merchants of the Dutch East India Company go to the East, they work for a couple of years. While they're in the East, they buy and have slaves, and they get accustomed to the lifestyle there. When they go back home, they finish their contracts, they go back home to Europe, they now have to give up their slaves because it's illegal in the Netherlands to have slaves. So you're working in the East, in Indonesia, India, Malaysia, you have a lot of slaves, but now when you finish your contract, you have to sell these slaves. You can sell them in the East, get a little bit of money, or you can bring them to the Cape. When you're going back, bring them to the Cape and sell them at the Cape, because Van Riebeeck and the people at the refreshment station, they desperately need the slaves. So they pay higher prices for it. So through this way, a number of slaves start going into the Cape. And these slaves are going to play a very, very important role in Cape society. In fact, the Castle of Good Hope, which is today a huge tourist attraction, was built on slave labor. It was a fort that was eventually transformed into a castle. And by introducing these measures, Van Riebeeck is able to make this refreshment station a success. Initially, it wasn't a success. Prior to the system of free burghers and the importation of slavery, it was supposed to provide passing ships with fresh produce, but the passing ships actually were responsible for the survival of the people at the Cape. They had to provide them with rice and things like that so that they could survive. They were able to produce a little, but now with these two new systems, the refreshment station is going to function a lot better. And Van Riebeeck, after 10 years, 1662, he can now go back to the East, where he'll spend the rest of his life, which is what he wants to do. A new commander will be in charge of the refreshment station. And this system will eventually start growing into a colony. And it's going to be a colony that not only has a European population, but it's going to have a huge slave population. In fact, these slaves are going to outnumber Europeans who are at this colony that's going to expand. Okay, so for the next 150 years, this colony is going to grow and become very large. Now, obviously, you can't cover everything that happens over this next 150 years, from about 1652, when Van Riebeeck establishes the refreshment station, until 1795, when the British arrive. But there are two things that are worth mentioning. One is the governorship of Simon van der Stel from 1679 to 1699, and the other is the arrival of the French Huguenots in 1687. So Simon van der Stel was one of the commanders of the refreshment station. After Van Riebeeck left, there'd be another commander. Eventually you got Simon van der Stel. And when Simon van der Stel, during his term, the Dutch were at war with France. And there was this fear that the French, who are also getting involved in this trade, might be able to take the colony from the Dutch. So Simon van der Stel's mission was to strengthen the colony, or what was still a growing little refreshment station. It was made up of the company's workers of the refreshment station and a few burghers, so those free farmers who were released from their contracts and allowed to settle and establish farms. So basically, Simon van der Stel wants to increase the burgher population. So he encourages more settlement. When passing ships go by, he encourages people to, instead of returning to Europe or going to the East, to settle here at the Cape. He also makes a lot of promises in Europe that, the climate Cape is great and it's wonderful, and why be in poverty in Europe when you can come establish a farm in South Africa or Southern Africa. It's not yet South Africa, but the Cape. Obviously not very honest. The climate and the soil is not actually that good for agriculture at the Cape. Cape Town maybe, but surrounding areas is actually very, very dry. Nonetheless, he encourages more European settlement. When more Europeans come in, armed with guns, so that it can fortify itself better against possible French attack These settlers come in, predominantly for a lot of them from Germany and from the Netherlands. They will eventually settle at the Cape as free farmer population. But when they arrive, they're also going to need slaves. More slaves are going to be imported to work with them, and hence the population is growing. These people don't establish farms because farmland is not, well, the land around the Cape is not actually that great for farming. So many of them become what is known as trek boards, and they start expanding. And the people they come into contact with are not large, powerful, settled armies. It's the Khoikhoi and the San who live in smaller groups. So it's a lot of wars between the Dutch and the it begins during Van Riebeck's time, and the Khoikhoi, competing modes of production, a lot of cattle theft, and from the Dutch who have a different, and Dutch sometimes when they're further away from the Cape colonial government at the refreshment station and they start trekking in the interior, they can break a lot of laws and instead of trading with the Khoikhoi, steal animals. Khoikhoi also have a different mode of production. They come to a fenced farm. They don't see, they see some cattle, they're just going to take it. There's no concept of, this farm belongs to the settlers. So anyway, the colony begins to expand during this time. Simon van der Stel, he establishes a village called Stellenbosch, named after van der Stel, and during his time, the population at the colony begins to grow. The other important event that's necessary to understanding the growth is the arrival of the French Huguenots. So in France, which is Catholic at this point in time, there's discrimination against the Huguenots. They cross the border into the Netherlands. More Protestant Netherlands will accept them. And now that these Huguenots were refugees in the Netherlands to escape persecution and torture, death in France, they come to the Netherlands, and during Simon van der Stel's term as governor, his concern is to grow the colony at the Cape. So a useful idea is to send these Huguenots to the Cape. When they arrive at the Cape, obviously they'll be very grateful to the Dutch. They will abandon the French language and learn Dutch. But also during this time, as a hybrid population is beginning to, or a hybrid language beginning to emerge, and a population is beginning to emerge. On one hand, you've got French, German, Dutch Europeans settling at the Cape, all forced to learn Dutch. You've got slaves coming from various parts of Indonesia, India, Malaysia, various different areas, various different languages, also from East Africa as well, coming to the Cape, bringing all these different cultures and traditions with them. And gradually got the evolution of a new type of language, which will be Afrikaans. So anyway, that's the story of the expansion of the Cape Colony during the Dutch period. But at the end of the 1700s, so just like the beginning of the 1500s, the dominant forces were Spain and Portugal. Then by the beginning of the 1600s, it's now the Netherlands. By the end of the 1700s, Britain and France are more dominating this international trade. And the French Revolution takes place. And during the French Revolution, obviously a lot of the other European monarchies will gang up and invade France to stop that revolution from spreading. But then Corsican general, leads the French army, named Napoleon Bonaparte, and they reverse the trend and they start attacking and invading and doing very well against the other European powers, until only Britain is really able to stand up against the French. Because Britain's an island with the best navy, it's very difficult for Napoleon's forces to attack Great Britain. But the French invade and attack and conquer the Netherlands and make it a kind of puppet state, kind of colonize it. It's now the Batavian Republic. The British at this point in time have a very lucrative, important colony. They've just lost the United States of America. They've lost something very valuable, but now they're gaining something very valuable, and that's India. India is absolutely crucial to Great Britain at this point in time. Now, the Dutch and the British had reasonable relations. The French and the British have not have good relations. The French have now invaded and conquered the Netherlands. What's stopping them from going to the Cape and taking their colony? And if the French take the Dutch colony, they're now able to stop the British from accessing will be able to interrupt the British en route to India. So it's going to be a very difficult situation for the British if the French conquer the Cape Colony. So to stop the French from conquering the Cape Colony, 1795, the British go to the Cape and attack and basically take it from the Dutch. But when they arrive, they don't really do much. They don't end the use of Dutch language. They don't intervene in legal matters. They don't intervene in slavery yet. They're just there to stop the French from taking it. There's a temporary peace in Europe. The Treaty of Amiens is signed, and Britain and France kind of patch up their differences with this peace treaty, and symbolic gesture of goodwill, the British will give back the colony to the Dutch, 1802. But it's not long before war breaks out in Europe again. The British will come back and take the colony again for the same reasons. The peace with France doesn't last for long. 1806, they return to the Cape, take the colony back from the Dutch. But this time they're going to stay. And after the Napoleonic Wars are concluded, and eventually in 1815, the British decide to formally make the Cape a British colony. They begin to realize there's strategic value to having this Cape colony. There's a number of reasons. One, it's halfway on the route to the east, easier for them to station British soldiers closer to India in case it's a possible mutiny. There's a little bit of a wine industry. There's various reasons that the British decide it's a good idea for us to take the Cape. But now they're going to start implementing a number of important changes. Make English the official language. They're going to, 1807, end the slave trade, end the importation of slaves. 1834, they're going to ban the practice of slavery altogether. They're going to give slave owners 4 years to get used to slowly moving their slaves into apprentices, and finally by 1838, entire freedom. So 1834, they pass this law. By 1838, slavery is going to come to an end. And they do various things like this. They will, freed slaves will be equal before the law as British and Dutch. So it's whites. Khoikhoi will be treated equal before the law. Anyone will be allowed to vote irrespective of race. Reality, there is property rights clauses and wealth that's responsible for whether you're eligible to vote. But in theory, anyone can vote irrespective of race. So a variety of factors, some, about 1/10 of the, we won't call them Dutch anymore because they're made up of French, Dutch, and German descendants from Europe, call them the Boers. About 1/10 decide now's the time to leave. They're angry. Some of them feel that what the British are doing by treating non-whites equal to whites is against the will of God. They use that terminology. Others are unhappy because when the British ended slavery, they felt that they didn't give slave owners the adequate compensation. By the ending slavery, they're kind of like the slaves are regarded as their property, and now that they're free, they don't get financial compensation for losing their property. They're angry with that. Some of them are angry that the fact that the British have made English the official language. So for a variety of reasons, they're going to leave the Cape and trek into the interior. Now, just something important that I didn't yet mention, which is important to understanding why how they trek into the interior. When the Dutch had established the Cape Colony, it grew, it expanded. As the Trek Boers moved over that 150-year period before the British arrived. But the expansion eastward stopped at about the Fish River, because they came into contact with no longer the San, the Khoikhoi, who live in smaller groups, but a large settled society, Bantu speakers, the Xhosa. And the Xhosa have large-standing armies. Now, you have a series of conflicts, border disputes, and wars, what will become the frontier wars, between the Xhosa and the Dutch, or the Boers. The British will arrive. When they take over, the frontier wars will now transition with the British Cape Colony against the Xhosa. But basically, the Dutch stopped expanding when they came into the contact with the Fish River. So now, during the Great Treks, they're going to go further north. Another thing that's important to note is the British, similar to Simon van der Stel, also decided to send a lot of poor to the Cape. The government at the time, the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, whenever you have major wars, you've got depression, a lot of poverty. They thought, instead of trying to introduce social welfare programs or deal with this head on, why not just send some of the poorest of the poor to the Cape? So again, they, just like Simon van der Stel did, they exaggerate the fertility of the land around the Cape, said, you could leave cold Europe where you're in poverty, go to this fertile, wonderful land where you'll be able to establish farms. And they send about 4,000 1820 settlers to the Cape. And these people will be positioned kind of in this border zone with the Amaxhosa. And they will arrive there. Most of them not actually farmers, various other skills, but again, it adds to the growing population at the Cape. In the meanwhile, the Boers who had left the Cape start trekking into the interior. And I won't go into too much detail about this. So in about 1835, 1 year after the law that ends slavery at the Cape, they start moving in waves. About 1/10 of the population, generally a wealthy individual with a lot of status, would leave and a bunch of followers would go with him, and they would start looking for new land to conquer. They would establish the Republic of Natalia after the Battle of Blood River with the Zulus, but then the British would decide that they're going to take that colony and the fur trekkers would have to leave. They will eventually establish 2 states, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal Republic, and the British will took this Cape Colony. They'll have Natal. Some Africans during this colonial conquest would have lost their independence. Some are still independent, but now minerals are going to be discovered. That is the topic of another video on this channel on the mineral revolution, so you can have a look at that. This video was just about how Europeans came to settle in Southern Africa, provide context for that video, so have a look at that. In this video, I've also went through a lot of things quite quickly, but there's extensive sources in the video description. So if you are interested in further reading, there's also a long podcast. You can access those sources. Thank you.